The chamber was enormous. It was the kind of room that was built to make visitors feel small, and it did its job well. The ceiling stretched so high above the floor that the upper galleries were lost in a soft blue haze. Thousands of seats filled the curved walls, rising in rings from the central floor like the inside of a great stone bowl. Every seat was taken. Delegates from 47 civilizations sat in their sections, some in environmental suits, some breathing filtered air through tubes, some simply sitting still with the quiet confidence of species that had ruled their corners of the galaxy for thousands of years. At the very center of it all, on a raised platform of dark polished stone, sat the 7 members of the Galactic Council Arbitration Board. And in the gallery, not at the main table, not on the platform, not even close to the floor, sat Ambassador Elena Vasquez of Earth. She had a small seat in the visitors section, row 11. It was the same seat they gave her every time. There was no placard with her name. There was no microphone in front of her. She was there to listen, not to speak. That was what it meant to be a Tier 3 provisional species. You came when called. You sat where told. You listened. She had been doing it for 6 years. Elena was a calm woman by nature. She had brown eyes that people often described as unreadable, and a way of sitting completely still that made other ambassadors uncomfortable. She was 44 years old, and she had spent most of those years studying people, alien and human alike, learning how they moved, how they lied, and how they showed contempt without knowing they were doing it. She was very good at reading contempt. She could see it now on the face of the lead arbiter, a Vorai elder named Counselor Dreth. He was ancient by any standard, with pale gray skin that had gone almost white with age and long, thin fingers that he steepled in front of him whenever he was about to say something he considered important. His species had been in the council for over 4,000 years. He had the slow, careful movements of something that had never once felt truly threatened. He was speaking now, and his translated voice came through the small earpiece in Elena's ear. "The matter before this council," Dreth said, his tone smooth and practiced, "is the incident of the 14th cycle, in which 3 human colonial installations in the Caro Belt suffered significant structural damage as a result of Keth Dominion navigational corrections in contested space." Elena kept her face still. Navigational corrections, that was what they were calling it. 3 weeks ago, Keth warships had entered the Caro Belt, a stretch of space that humanity had been quietly building in for 11 years, and opened fire. Not once, not in a single pass. They had come back 3 times over 6 days, and by the end of it, the colony on Caro 3 was a field of debris. Caro 7 had lost its atmosphere processor and was running on emergency reserves. Caro 12, the smallest of the 3, had simply gone silent. 4,217 people lived in those colonies, past tense for some of them. The final count was still not complete. The Keth representative, a broad-shouldered creature named Vrathsane, sat at the main table directly across from Counselor Dreth. He had a wide, flat face, dark scales, and small yellow eyes that did not blink often. Right now those eyes were pointed at the ceiling with an expression that Elena could only describe as boredom. He was not worried. He had no reason to be. Counselor Dreth continued. "After extensive deliberation, the arbitration board finds that the incident, while regrettable, falls within the range of contested boundary interactions that have been documented across 17 similar cases in council history. The Keth Dominion has offered a formal statement of acknowledgement and proposes a reparations package to be structured over the next 4 cycles." A murmur moved through parts of the chamber, not outrage, more like the sound of people settling into their seats, getting comfortable because the conclusion was already clear and everyone knew it. Elena looked at the data pad in her hands. It showed the names of the colonies, the names of the dead. She had read them so many times in the past 3 weeks that she could recite them in her sleep. She did not look away from the list. "It is the recommendation of this council," Dreth said, that the human administrative body of Earth accept the offered reparations and pursue no further escalatory action. The stability of this region depends on measured responses, and it is the Council's firm belief that young species benefit greatly from the guidance of this body in moments of emotional difficulty. Emotional difficulty. Elena closed the data pad. The vote was called. Each delegation pressed their indicator. The tally appeared on the massive display behind the arbitration platform, glowing in soft green and red. 44 in favor of the Council's recommendation, 3 opposed. The 3 who opposed were small species, newer members, species that had their own reasons for understanding what it felt like to be told to sit down and accept it. Their votes changed nothing, but Elena noted them. She always noted them. Vrath Sane, the Keth representative, turned in his seat and looked up at the visitors' gallery. He found Elena's face without much effort, as if he had known exactly where she was sitting. And then he did something that was unmistakable in any language, in any culture, across any species barrier. He smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had just won without trying. The smile of someone who expected no consequences. Elena held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away and pulled out her communication device. She typed a short message and sent it to the secure channel that went directly to the office of the Secretary of Defense on Earth. The message had no preamble, no emotional content, and no request for instructions. It was simply a statement of fact. It said they said no. She put the device back in her pocket, picked up her things, and walked out of the gallery without waiting for the formal close of session. In the corridor outside, the air was cooler, cleaner. The distant hum of the station's environmental systems was the only sound. Elena walked slowly, her footsteps quiet on the smooth floor, and she let herself think for just a moment about Caro 3. About what it must have looked like from the surface when the first Keth ship appeared in the sky. About whether the people there had time to understand what was happening, or whether it had simply been over before they could form the thought. She let herself feel it, fully, for about 40 seconds. Then she put it away. Her communication device buzzed in her pocket. She took it out and read the reply from Earth. It was 4 words. We heard them, good. She read it twice. Then she allowed herself the smallest breath of something that might, from a distance, have looked like relief. It was not relief, exactly. It was something closer to recognition. The feeling of a door closing on one part of a plan and another part beginning. She did not know every detail of what was already in motion. That was by design. She knew enough to do her job here, and her job was to be seen sitting in row 11 of the visitors' gallery, being ignored, looking like someone who had just been told no and had no answer to it. She was very good at looking like that. On the other side of the station, in a small monitoring room that no delegation had been assigned, a junior council intelligence analyst named Sethka sat in front of a wall of data screens. She was young for a Vorai, with gray skin that still had a faint warmth to it that age had not yet taken away. She had been watching the session on a feed and had seen the vote, and had seen the smile from the Keth representative. But she was not looking at any of that now. She was looking at a series of long-range sensor logs from the outer edges of human space. Logs that showed, very clearly, that 3 weeks ago, the same week that the Keth bombardment had taken place, a very large amount of human shipping traffic had simply stopped appearing on any tracking system. Not diverted, not delayed. Gone. As if something very large had moved somewhere that no one was watching and had not come back. Sethka stared at the data for a long time. Then she started writing a report. The asteroid had no name. It had a number in a catalog that nobody read, sitting in a long list of other numbers that described other rocks drifting in the cold dark of the outer solar system. It was roughly the size of a small city, shaped like a broken tooth. and it had been quietly ignored by every telescope and survey drone that had ever passed near it. That was not an accident. Inside the asteroid, carved out over decades of slow and careful work, was the largest shipyard humanity had ever built. It had no official name on any public record. The people who worked there called it the Yard. That was enough. Admiral Dara Osai had first visited the yard 17 years ago, when it was still mostly hollow rock and scaffolding, and the smell of welding smoke. She had stood on a metal platform and looked down into a construction bay so deep that the lights at the bottom looked like distant stars. A senior engineer had stood beside her and said, very quietly, that they were going to fill every one of those bays, that it would take time, that no one outside, a very small number of people, would ever know it existed until the day it was needed. That day had come. Dara was 51 years old now. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and the kind of face that had been weathered by years of making hard decisions and living with them afterward. She wore her uniform with no decoration beyond her rank insignia. She did not need decoration. Everyone in the yard knew who she was and what she was there to do. She stood on the main observation deck and looked out through the reinforced viewport at the fleet. There were 112 warships in the yard's bays, not small ships, not patrol craft or diplomatic escorts. These were deep space combat vessels, built for one purpose and designed with 60 years of quiet study behind every choice. They had been constructed in sections in different locations across the solar system and brought here in pieces disguised as mining equipment and industrial cargo. They had been assembled slowly in silence, behind the asteroid's electromagnetic shielding that scattered any sensor signal that came too close. The Council's intelligence network was considered one of the finest in the galaxy. It had never detected a single one of these ships. Dara looked at them for a long moment. Then she turned away from the viewport and walked back to the planning room. The table in the planning room was covered in holographic displays, star maps, defense grid overlays, patrol route data, timeline projections. 3 people were already seated when she came in. She sat down without ceremony and looked at each of them in turn. The first was Dr. Yuan Sato, a small and quiet man in his 60s who had the permanent look of someone whose mind was working on 3 problems at the same time. He was the lead engineer behind the Ghost Drive, and he had been working on it for most of his adult life. The Ghost Drive was a fold space propulsion system. Other species had fold space drives. The difference was that every other fold space drive in the known galaxy produced a detectable energy wake when it activated. A bright flash of radiation that sensors could read from light years away. It was how the Council's tracking networks functioned. You could not move a large ship through fold space without announcing yourself. The Ghost Drive produced no wake, no flash, no signal. A ship equipped with it could cross from one end of a star system to the other and arrive without any prior warning at all. It simply appeared where it had not been a moment before. Yuan had spent 19 years on the theoretical framework alone. Another 12 building and testing prototypes in the deep outer system where no one would notice the trial runs. The fleet outside had Ghost Drives in every hull. The second person at the table was Commander Rin Nakamura, who was young enough that Dara sometimes forgot how much she had already done. Rin was 36, lean and quiet, with the particular stillness of someone trained to be invisible. She commanded Earth's deep cover insertion teams, small groups of highly trained operatives whose entire existence was unknown to every intelligence service in the Council network. For the past 14 months, her people had been living inside Keth space. Not on warships, not at military installations. Inside the Keth Dominion itself, moving through civilian infrastructure, building networks, mapping every defense system the Keth had from the inside. When the bombardment of the Caro colonies had happened, Rin's teams were already there, already watching, already sending data back through communication channels so deeply encoded that they looked like background radiation. The third person was a man named Director Harlan Cole, who ran the intelligence division that coordinated everything. He was heavy-set and gray-haired and said very little. He was the kind of man who made other people nervous without doing anything to cause it. He had a data pad in front of him, and he slid it across the table to Dara without comment. She picked it up and read it. It was a full operational summary, 61 pages. She had already read it twice, but she read the key sections again now. The fleet deployment timeline, the Ghost Drive activation sequence, the ground team objectives inside Keth space, the communications blackout protocol that would keep Earth's intentions invisible until the moment they were no longer needed to be. She set the pad down. "The council voted this morning," she said. 44-3. Alina's message came in an hour ago. No one at the table looked surprised. No one looked angry either. That was the thing about these particular people. They had been expecting this outcome for a long time. They had built everything in this asteroid and trained every person in this fleet and spent years of their lives on this work precisely because they had always believed that the moment would come when the galaxy's most powerful governing body would look at a pile of dead human colonists and decide it was not worth the trouble. They had not built the fleet as a reaction to that decision. They had built it as the answer to it. "Timeline holds," Dara said. It was not a question, she was confirming. Ewan nodded. "All drives are tested and ready. We can begin staged departure in 8 hours without any detectable signature increase in this sector." Rin pulled up a display on the table. It showed a map of the Keth Dominion, covered in small markers. Ground teams are in position across all 6 primary target systems. They've had eyes on the planetary defense grid for 11 days. Shift rotations, patrol windows, command code cycling intervals. We have all of it. Director Cole finally spoke. His voice was low and even. "Communications blackout is already in effect for all military channels. As far as anyone watching is concerned, Earth went quiet because we're grieving." Dara looked at the star map for a moment. She thought about the Keth representative and his smile. She thought about 4,000 colonists and a council that had called their deaths a navigational correction. She thought about the 60 years of work that lived in this asteroid, in the hulls of those ships, in the people who had given most of their lives to building something that might never be needed but was always ready. "Begin departure sequence," she said. "Staged, 6-hour intervals between groups. No active comms until we reach the staging point." Ewan stood and left. Rin closed her display and followed. Director Cole gathered his pad and paused at the door. "They think we're sitting at home crying," he said. Dara did not look up from the star map. "I know," she said. "Let them." Cole left. Dara sat alone in the planning room for a while. Outside the viewport, the first bay doors were already beginning to open, slow and silent, letting in the black. The first ship moved out without any light, without any signal, without any trace that could be read by anything watching from the outside. It was a very large ship. It disappeared into the dark as if it had never been there at all. On Council Station Verath 9, in her small monitoring room, Sethka finished her report and sent it to her supervisor. The report was 23 pages long. It detailed the disappearance of human shipping traffic, the unusual silence from Earth's military communication bands, and a pattern of microanomalies in deep space sensor data that she believed, when taken together, pointed to something large moving in a region of space that was not well covered by the Council's sensor network. She was thorough, she was precise. She had checked every figure 3 times. Her supervisor read the summary paragraph and sent back a single line. "Humans grieve loudly. The silence means they've accepted it. File this under routine monitoring and focus on the Delvari border situation." Sethka read the reply. She looked at her data again. She did not file it under routine monitoring. She kept it open on her screen and stared at it. And the feeling she had in her chest was one that her species called *vreth. There was no direct translation in most languages. The closest version in human terms was the specific unease of knowing something is wrong and having no one believe you. She sat with that feeling for a long time. The supply convoy was called Keth Logistics Run 7 Alpha. It was not a glamorous assignment. It had never been a glamorous assignment. The 4 ships in the convoy carried food processors, fuel cells, and replacement parts for the defense stations along the Dominion's outer border, and they made the same run every 18 days on a route so routine that the crews had stopped paying close attention to it years ago. On the morning of the 14th day after the council vote, Run 7 Alpha left the Keth Mid-System Depot on schedule. The departure was logged. The route was filed. The 4 ships moved out into open space at standard cruising speed, and the depot's tracking system watched them go. They never arrived at the first checkpoint. There was no distress signal, no explosion, no debris field picked up by any sensor in the region. The tracking system simply stopped receiving their automated position pings at a point roughly 4 hours into the journey, in a stretch of empty space where nothing unusual had ever happened before and where there was, as far as anyone could tell, absolutely nothing to cause a problem. The Keth Border Authority logged it as a probable sensor relay failure and sent a secondary ship to investigate. The secondary ship found nothing, empty space, no convoy, no wreckage, nothing. The report was filed, a search was ordered, the search found nothing. 3 days later, a different convoy on a different route went the same way. Admiral Grathvel was not a man who frightened easily. He had commanded Keth military forces for 22 years. He had fought in 2 border conflicts and overseen the suppression of a colony, uprising that most of the Dominion's history books now referred to in politely vague terms. He was broad and scarred, and had the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years staring at tactical displays in poorly lit command rooms. He did not frighten easily. But he was sitting in his command room on the Keth military station Vorketh 9, looking at a screen full of incident reports, and he was feeling something that was not quite fear, but was close enough to its neighborhood to make him uncomfortable. In the past 11 days, 6 convoys had vanished. 2 outer border stations had gone completely dark, no final message, no emergency beacon, no sign of attack. A long-range patrol craft sent to investigate one of the dark stations had reported nothing unusual and then had itself stopped transmitting 40 minutes later. And then there was the sensor issue. Grathvel pulled up the technical report from the maintenance division. It was long and full of cautious engineering language, but the summary was simple. The long-range sensor arrays covering the outer boundary of the Dominion space were functioning normally. All diagnostics came back clean. There was no hardware fault that could be identified. And yet the arrays were showing nothing. Not interference, not damaged readings, just a wide, calm, empty picture of space that looked completely ordinary in every direction. He had been in the military long enough to know that there were 2 explanations for sensors that showed nothing. The first was that there was nothing there. The second was that something was making sure the sensors showed nothing. He sent a message to High Command flagging his concerns. He requested permission to move 2 patrol fleets to the outer boundary for a direct visual sweep. He wanted eyes out there, not just sensors. High Command responded within the hour. The response told him that the convoy disappearances were under investigation by the Logistics Division, that the dark stations were most likely experiencing the same sensor relay issues that had been affecting several other installations this quarter, and that moving patrol fleets to the outer boundary based on what amounted to a maintenance problem was an unnecessary use of resources. It also reminded him, in the particular tone that High Command used when it wanted to end a conversation, that the Dominion's military position was strong, and that there was no credible threat in the outer regions. Grathvel read the response twice. Then he pulled up the incident reports again and looked at them for a long time. He thought about the convoys. He thought about the dark stations. He thought about sensors that showed nothing but clean, empty, perfectly ordinary space. He thought about the human colonies in the Caro Belt. He had not thought much about those colonies when the order came down to carry out the bombardment. It had been a clean operation, militarily speaking. Quick, efficient. The colonies had no meaningful defense capability. There had been no resistance worth noting. He had not thought much about it afterward either. The council had handled the political side. Everything had been settled. The humans had been told to accept the reparations and stand down, and from everything Grathvel had seen in the weeks since, that was exactly what they were doing. Earth had gone quiet. No military movements, no threats, no unusual activity. Just silence. He sat with that thought for a while. Then he got up and walked to the viewport and looked out at the space around his station. It looked the same as it always did. Dark, empty, calm. He went back to his desk and began writing a second message to High Command. This one was longer, more detailed. He listed every incident in order. He included the sensor anomaly reports. He made the case clearly and without emotion. He sent it. High Command did not respond for 6 hours. When they did, the message was shorter than the first one. "You are overthinking this, Admiral. Stand by your post." On Council Station Vareth 9, Sethka had not slept well in 8 days. She had kept her report open on her screen every day since her supervisor had dismissed it. She had not been able to stop adding to it. Every morning she checked the monitoring feeds that her station was responsible for, and every morning she found something new that did not sit right. The human military communication bands were still silent. That alone was not unusual. Species in political distress often went quiet, but the pattern of the silence was wrong. It was too clean. There were no civilian overflow signals blurring the edges of the military bands. No unofficial chatter from human shipping operators complaining about route disruptions or delays. Nothing that you would expect from a species genuinely sitting still and grieving. It was the silence of something that had moved. She had also been watching the long-range data from the edge of Keth space. The public feeds that the Council Monitoring Network pulled from the Dominion's own sensor relays. The Keth relays were reporting everything normal, but Sethka had learned, a long time ago, to compare what sensors reported against what other data sources suggested. And the other data sources, gravitational drift readings from a research station near the Keth border, minor electromagnetic variation logs from an unmanned survey probe that nobody had thought to decommission, were telling a slightly different story. Not a dramatic story, not flashing alarms, just small, quiet inconsistencies, the kind that only appeared if you were looking for them and knew what they meant. Sethka was looking for them, and she thought she knew what they meant. She wrote a second report. It was 31 pages. She sent it not just to her supervisor this time, but to the senior monitoring director, and after a moment of hesitation, directly to the Council's chief intelligence officer. The senior monitoring director sent back a 2-line reply telling her to focus on her assigned sectors. The chief intelligence officer did not reply at all. Sethka sat back in her chair and pressed her fingers together and stared at the ceiling of her small monitoring room. The hum of the station's systems was steady and constant around her. Everything on Vareth 9 felt calm and ordered and normal, the way it always did, because the Council's station was very good at feeling calm and ordered and normal. She looked at her screen, at the rows of data she had assembled over 8 days, at the pattern she could see in it as clearly as she could see her own reflection. She thought about the human ambassador, Elena Vasquez. She had reviewed the session footage a dozen times. She had watched Elena's face when the vote was announced. Most species, when told that the deaths of their people were being filed as a navigational correction, showed something: anger, grief, shock. Even the species that were culturally reserved showed something in the small muscles around the eyes or in the set of the jaw. Elena Vasquez had shown nothing. Not suppressed emotion, not controlled grief, nothing. She had sat perfectly still for a moment, then closed her data pad and then looked up at the Keth representative when he smiled at her. And in that moment, something had passed across Elena's face that Sethka had paused and replayed 15 times without being fully able to name. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was the expression of someone who had just watched a thing happen exactly the way they expected it to happen. Sethka pulled up the clip one more time and watched it again. Then she started writing a third report. This one she addressed only to herself, saved in a personal encrypted file, because she no longer expected anyone else to read it in time. The title of the file was a question. It said, "What does a human look like when they have already decided?" On the bridge of the USCS Unyielding, the lights were set low. The bridge crew worked in near silence, which was unusual for a vessel this size but had become normal over the past several days. There was no order to be quiet. People were quiet because it felt right, because the kind of work being done here was the kind of work that did not need noise around it. Admiral Dara Osai stood at the main tactical display and looked at the layout of the Keth homeworld's orbital defense grid. Every gun placement, every patrol route, every checkpoint, every shift change, every gap between one patrol ending and the next beginning. It was all there, mapped in precise detail by people who had spent months watching it from the inside. It was a formidable grid, well designed, layered carefully to cover approaches from every expected direction. She had been studying it for 4 days. She had found 17 separate gaps. Her tactical team had found 11 more. She checked the chronometer on the display. 17 hours. One of her junior officers appeared at her shoulder with a coffee in a sealed cup, the kind designed to work in low-gravity environments. Dara took it without looking away from the display. "Anything from the ground teams?" she asked. "Last update 30 minutes ago," the officer said. "All teams confirm position. No change to defense schedules. They haven't moved anything." Dara nodded slowly. Of course they hadn't moved anything. They did not know there was anything to move things for. She took a slow drink of her coffee and looked at the orbital grid. 17 hours. She thought about Caro 3, about Caro 7 running on emergency reserves, about Caro 12 going silent. She thought about a smile. 17 hours, she said quietly, to no one in particular. The bridge stayed quiet around her. Outside the viewports, in the deep black between stars, 112 ships held their positions in perfect silence. No running lights. No active signals, no trace on any sensor net in the galaxy. Waiting. There was no countdown. No speech, no dramatic announcement over the fleet-wide channel, no moment where someone said something that would later be carved into a monument. Admiral Dara Osai had specifically forbidden all of those things. She had told her senior staff in plain and simple terms that what they were about to do was not a performance. It was a job, and jobs did not need speeches. At exactly 4 in the morning, station time, she looked at her tactical officer and gave the only order she gave that hour. "Begin," she said. And the fleet moved. The Keth homeworld had a name that translated roughly into the human phrase, the seat of all things. It was a large planet, heavy with industry and history, ringed by 3 natural moons and a dense belt of orbital infrastructure that had taken the Keth centuries to build. Defense platforms, sensor arrays, weapons batteries, and patrol routes so layered and overlapping that approaching the planet from any direction in open space was effectively a death sentence for any known vessel. The key word was known. The first anyone on those platforms knew that something was happening was when 17 human warships appeared simultaneously inside the defense grid's inner boundary. Not approaching it, not detected at range and tracked inward. Inside it, where they had not been a fraction of a second before. The ghost drive produced no flash, no warning signal, no energy wake that sensors could read. One moment the inner zone was empty. The next moment it was not. For approximately 4 seconds, the Keth platform operators simply did not react, because what they were seeing was not a thing their training had prepared them for. Every defensive protocol they had was built around detecting a threat at distance and responding to its approach. There were no protocols for a threat that skipped the approach entirely. Those 4 seconds were all it took. The human ships moved with a kind of precision that was almost uncomfortable to watch on a tactical display. They did not destroy the weapons platforms. They disabled them. There was a difference, and it was a difference that had been planned for carefully. Targeted pulse strikes to power relay junctions. Precision shots to thruster assemblies that left hulls intact but dead in space. The Keth crews inside those platforms were shaken and rattled and suddenly sitting in the dark, but they were breathing. Every one of them was breathing. Within 11 minutes, the entire inner orbital defense grid around the Keth homeworld was silent. The outer grid tried to respond. Patrol ships turned inward, accelerating hard, broadcasting emergency signals to high command on the surface. They made it approximately a third of the way to the inner zone before they found that their command codes had stopped working. The encrypted authorization sequences that allowed them to activate combat systems had been silently and remotely overwritten sometime in the past 72 hours. They could fly. They could not fight. On the surface of the planet, the military command center registered the emergency signals from orbit and attempted to mobilize the ground defense network. The order went out on the primary command channel and was received correctly by every installation, and then executed exactly as issued. Nothing happened. The order went out again. Then a senior communications officer discovered that while the command channel was transmitting perfectly, the receiving systems at every major military installation had been rerouted. The orders were going out. They were being received. They were simply being received by a set of dummy terminals that had been quietly substituted into the network at some point that nobody could yet identify, and that were doing nothing with the orders except storing them in a log that would later make for very interesting reading. The work of Commander Rin Nakamura's ground teams was thorough and nearly invisible, and had taken 14 months to put in place. The Keth High Command attempted to reach their emergency reserve fleet, stationed in the Vorketh system 2 light towers away. The fleet was their insurance, the largest collection of warships the Dominion maintained, held back from regular deployment specifically for moments like this. The emergency signal reached the Vorketh system. The reserve fleet did not respond, because the reserve fleet was currently docked in its berths with every docking clamp engaged and locked, and every power core sitting at minimum standby, not because of any malfunction, but because a very small team of Rin's operatives had spent the previous 48 hours making sure that was where it would stay. At the 3-hour mark, Admiral Grathvel, still at his post on Station Vorketh 9, was staring at an emergency board that was lit up in so many places it looked almost decorative. He was not saying anything. He was standing very still with his hands behind his back looking at the board, and the officers around him were also very still because none of them had anything useful to say, and they understood that. He had sent High Command 2 urgent reports in the past 6 days, warning them that something was wrong. High Command had told him he was overthinking it. He thought about that now. He found that he did not feel angry about it, which surprised him slightly. He mostly felt tired, the kind of tired that came not from lack of sleep but from having been right about something terrible and having no one listen. He had a feeling he understood, for the first time, something about how the people on those human colonies might have felt. He sat down slowly in his command chair and waited to see what came next. What came next at the 4-hour mark was the broadcast. Commander Rin Nakamura was not a person who enjoyed attention. She was at her best when no one knew she was there, which was a quality that had served her extremely well for the past 14 months. But this part of the operation had been assigned to her specifically because Dara had said simply that she had earned it. Rin was sitting in a small room in a civilian communications hub on the outskirts of the Keth homeworld's largest city. The room smelled like recycled air and old cable insulation. 3 members of her team sat at consoles around her, having quietly and completely taken over the hub's broadcasting infrastructure over the past 6 hours. Outside the window, the city looked normal. Traffic moved. Lights were on in buildings. Most of the population had no idea what had happened in orbit above them. The silence from their military had not yet filtered down to the streets. Rin looked at the screen in front of her. She looked at the text of the message she was about to broadcast on every available frequency, to every receiver in the Dominion, to every council monitoring station, to every listening device in the region of space that contained both human territory and Keth territory. She read it one more time. Then she nodded to the technician beside her. The broadcast went out. It reached the Keth homeworld first, then spread outward at the speed of light toward every other system in the Dominion. It reached Council Station Verath 9 about 11 minutes later. It reached the monitoring stations of a dozen other species within the hour. It was picked up by independent relay networks and retransmitted automatically before anyone thought to try to stop it. And by the time anyone did think to try to stop it, it had already been copied and stored in too many places to ever fully remove. The message was not long. It was not written in the language of diplomacy or military declaration. It was written in plain language, the kind that translated cleanly into every known tongue without losing its meaning, because the people who wrote it had wanted to be absolutely certain that there was no way to misread it. It said, "This is not war. This is consequence. The military forces of the Keth Dominion have been neutralized across all primary systems. Your civilian population is unharmed and will remain so. Your ships are grounded. Your command network is offline. This was done in 9 hours because it was prepared for 60 years. The colonies you destroyed had names: Caro 3, Caro 7, Caro 12. 4,217 people lived there. We remember every one of them. We do not ask permission to answer for our dead. We never have. We never will. United Earth Command." On Council Station Verath 9, the message appeared on every screen simultaneously. In the main chamber, a session on an entirely unrelated trade dispute was interrupted when every display in the room flickered and changed. Delegates from 47 civilizations read the same words at the same time in their own languages. The chamber went very quiet. Counselor Dreth, the ancient Vorai arbiter who had called humanity emotionally volatile and told them to accept reparations and sit down, sat at the center of the arbitration platform and stared at the screen in front of him. His long gray fingers were completely still on the table. He did not speak. In the back of the chamber, Sethka stood with her third report still in her hands, the one she had never sent to anyone, the one addressed only to herself. And she read the broadcast on the screen on the wall, and she felt something move through her that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief, and was probably some precise mixture of both. She had asked, in the title of her private file, what a human looked like when they had already decided. Now she thought she knew the answer. They looked exactly like Ambassador Elena Vasquez had looked in row 11 of the visitors' gallery, sitting perfectly still with her data pad closed in her lap, watching a council vote 44-3 to do nothing. They looked like someone who had already done the math. The emergency session was called within hours of the broadcast. It was the fastest the Galactic Council had ever convened in its 4,000-year history. Delegations that normally took days to arrange travel were already on the station. Species that had never bothered to send physical representatives and usually participated through quantum link feeds were suddenly very interested in being present in the room. Every seat in the great chamber was filled before the session was formally opened, and the overflow galleries that had not been used in living memory were opened and filled as well. Everyone wanted to see what happened next. The answer to that question walked through the main entrance of the chamber at precisely the time she had been given, and she walked alone. Elena Vasquez had not changed her clothes from the last time she had sat in this chamber. She wore the same dark jacket, the same plain shoes, the same expression that gave away exactly nothing. She carried a single item, a small data chip held loosely between two fingers, the way someone might carry something that was not especially heavy but was very important. What was different this time was where she was going. 2 council security officers had met her at the entrance, not to stop her, to escort her. They walked ahead of her down the long central aisle of the chamber, through the noise of hundreds of alien voices going quiet as she passed, and they led her directly to the main floor, to the central table, to a chair that had a placard in front of it, placed there within the last hour by someone who had clearly decided to get ahead of the situation. The placard said, "Earth Ambassador Vasquez." Elena sat down. She placed the data chip on the table in front of her. She folded her hands and looked at Counselor Dreth, who was sitting in his place at the arbitration platform directly across from her. Dreth looked older than he had 3 weeks ago, which was not easy for a species that aged as slowly as the Vori. He sat very straight, and his expression was composed and carefully neutral, the way it always was, but there was something behind his eyes that had not been there before. Something that Elena recognized because she had seen it before in other rooms, on other faces, after other moments when reality had corrected someone's assumptions about how the world worked. He called the session to order. The chamber went silent. He looked at Elena and said, in the measured tone of someone choosing each word with great care, that the council had convened to discuss the events of the past 9 hours and to hear from the human representative directly. Elena nodded. She stood. She spoke for 4 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not use dramatic pauses for effect or let anger into her words or say anything that was designed to humiliate anyone in the room. She spoke in plain, clear language, the same way the broadcast had been written, because clarity was not just the most honest approach. It was also, in this particular moment, the most powerful one. She said that humanity had not acted out of rage. She said that what had been done in the past 9 hours had been planned and prepared over 60 years by people who understood that the galaxy was not always fair and that fairness, when it did not come on its own, sometimes had to be built in advance. She said that the 3 colony worlds would be rebuilt, that the reconstruction would be funded entirely by the Keth Dominion, under terms that humanity had already drawn up and that were non-negotiable. She placed a second data chip on the table beside the first one. The terms were on that chip, and they were detailed and they were final. She said that any governing body, any species, any military force that chose to fire on a human settlement in the future should understand clearly and completely that there would be no warning given beforehand, no ultimatum offered, and no vote called in any chamber that would change what came after. And then she paused, not for effect, simply because the next part mattered and she wanted the room to be fully quiet when she said it. She said that Earth was formally requesting a permanent seat at the council table, not a provisional designation, not a Tier 3 status with a visitor's pass and a chair in row 11 of the gallery. A full seat with full voting rights, recognized as equal to every other member at this table, effective immediately. She sat down. The chamber was silent for a long time. It was the kind of silence that had weight to it. Not the silence of a room where no one had anything to say, but the silence of a room where everyone had something to say, and no one wanted to be the first to say it. Because the first person to speak would have to decide what position they were taking, and that decision felt very significant right now. Counselor Dreth looked at the 2 data chips on the table. He looked at Alina. He looked slowly around the chamber at the delegations of 46 other civilizations, all of whom were looking back at him. He had been on this council for longer than most species in this room had been spacefaring. He had guided and shaped and occasionally manipulated the political direction of the galaxy's most powerful governing body for decades. He was not a man who was often at a loss. He was, at this moment, very slightly at a loss. He looked at the data chip with the operational record on it, the full documentation of everything humanity had done, every step, every year of preparation, every system disabled without a single civilian casualty, every Keth soldier sitting alive in a dark and powerless ship somewhere, probably wondering the same thing Dreth himself was wondering right now. He looked at it for a long time. Then he reached forward and picked it up and slotted it into the reader built into the arbitration platform. The data opened on the display behind him. Numbers, timelines, coordinates, technical specifications. 60 years of work laid out in clean and organized detail. The ghost fleet, the drives that left no wake, the ground teams, the rerouted command networks, the locked docking clamps, all of it assembled not in anger but in patience, not in reaction but in preparation. He read for 2 minutes. The chamber stayed quiet. Then Dreth set the chip down and looked at Alina. "The motion for full membership," he said slowly, in a voice that was quieter than usual and entirely without the comfortable authority it normally carried, "requires a second." From the left side of the chamber, one of the 3 delegations that had voted against the original resolution immediately signaled. Then a second. Then, after a pause that lasted about 4 seconds, a third signal came from a delegation that had voted with the majority 3 weeks ago. Then more. Not all at once. One by one, with the particular careful speed of people making a decision they had already actually made and were now simply making official. Dreth watched the indicators appear across his board. The final count took less than 2 minutes. 47-0. Alina did not smile. She did not show anything on her face. She simply nodded once, the way someone nodded when a thing they had worked toward for a very long time finally arrived, and there was no drama in it because the work had already been done and this was just the confirmation of it. She picked up both data chips and put them in her jacket pocket and stood to leave. She had almost reached the exit of the chamber when she heard footsteps behind her, quick and light. She turned. Sethka was young and slightly out of breath from moving fast through the crowd, and she was holding a data pad against her chest with both hands. She stopped a few feet from Alina and straightened slightly, the way someone straightened when they wanted to appear more composed than they currently felt. She introduced herself. She said her name and her position in the Council Intelligence Monitoring Division. She said that she had filed 3 reports over the past 11 days, that she had seen something in the data that suggested a large movement in human space, that no one had listened. Alina looked at her for a moment. Sethka held up the data pad. The 3rd report was still open on it, still addressed to no one but herself. Alina took the pad and looked at it. She scrolled through it slowly, reading. Her expression stayed even, but her eyes moved with the particular focus of someone who was reading something and actually taking it in, not just looking at the surface of it. She read for about a minute, then she handed the pad back. "You got all of this from public monitoring feeds," Alina said. Sethka said yes. Alina was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and took out a small card and held it out. Sethka took it. It had a secure contact address on it and a 4-word line of text beneath the address. The 4 words were, We listen to analysts. Elena turned and walked out of the chamber. Sethka stood in the corridor for a while, holding the card in both hands, and looked back through the open doors at the chamber where 47 civilizations were already beginning to talk loudly all at once about everything that had just changed. She thought about 8 days of reports that no one had read. She thought about the feeling her species called asterisk vreth, that specific unease of knowing something was wrong and having no one believe you. She thought that it was a feeling she would probably not have again for a very long time. She put the card carefully into her pocket and walked away down the corridor, and for the first time in 8 days, she was not thinking about the data on her screens. She was thinking about what came next.